In October 1973, Arab oil ministers met in Kuwait and made a decision that would reshape the world. Within weeks, oil prices quadrupled, gas stations ran dry. Americans who had never thought about where their energy came from were lining up before sunrise for a chance to fill their tank. The economy went into a decade-long convulsion, and in a condemned Victorian house in West Berkeley, California, a small group of scientists and architects began asking a question that the rest of the country had somehow never thought to ask. What if you didn't need the grid at all? Not in theory, not in a remote compound in the mountains. Right here, in the city, on a standard residential lot, surrounded by neighbors and roads and everything that defines ordinary American urban life. What if a house could grow its own food, generate its own heat, recycle its own waste, and run for years on a utility bill that was, not metaphorically, but actually, $30 a month? They didn't just ask the question, they built the answer. This is the story of the integral urban house, the most documented, most radical, most deliberately forgotten experiment in American residential history. A house that proved, in real life, with real numbers, that everything we think we need from the grid in the grocery store and the municipal water system is optional. A house that worked perfectly for 10 years and was then, very quietly, killed. If you want to understand why you have never heard of it, start with the people who built it. Sim van der Rijn was born in the Netherlands in 1935, into a Jewish family that fled to New York when he was 4, one step ahead of the Holocaust. He grew up on the outskirts of the city, between marshes and vacant lots, and developed what he would later call a lifelong concern for the connection between human beings and the physical world they inhabit. By the early 1960s, he was teaching architecture at the University of California at Berkeley, and by the early 1970s, he had reached a conclusion that many in his profession found uncomfortable, that modern American building design was not just aesthetically bankrupt, but ecologically catastrophic. The American suburb was engineered for maximum consumption. Every house needed a gas line, an electrical hookup, a water main, a sewage connection, and a car to reach the store that sold the food the house had no capacity to produce. Each home was a terminal point on a network of dependencies so extensive and so invisible that most Americans had simply stopped noticing it existed. Then, in October 1973, OPEC cut the cord, and 4 decades of cheap assumptions collapsed in a single autumn. Van der Rijn had been working on this problem for years before the crisis made it urgent for everyone else. He helped found the Farallones Institute, a nonprofit research organization committed to what they called whole systems design. The idea was simple and radical. A house is not just a building, it is an ecosystem. If you design it like one, using closed loops rather than open pipelines, with outputs becoming inputs instead of waste, you can reach a fundamentally different relationship between people and the resources they need to live. In 1972, 2 years before the house was acquired, the Farallones Institute had already built the Energy Pavilion, a small public structure on the Berkeley campus demonstrating solar heating, composting, and greywater recycling. It opened to the public just as OPEC announced the embargo. Local television covered it. Lines of curious visitors formed. Van der Rijn and his colleagues, including Bill and Helga Olkowski, a husband and wife team of biologists who had pioneered organic urban food production and written one of the first practical guides to growing food in the city, decided it was time to go further. Not a pavilion, not a demonstration panel, a real house. A house that real people lived in, that was open to the public every week, and that was being measured, documented, and evaluated with the rigor of a scientific experiment. In October 1974, the Farallones Institute purchased a dilapidated Victorian cottage at 1516 5th Street in West Berkeley. The building had most recently been used as a drug rehabilitation center by the city of Berkeley. It sat adjacent to a stretch of run-down industrial buildings. The freeway hummed constantly in the background. This was not a utopian compound in the countryside. It was a working-class urban street, one block from a neighborhood being torn apart by urban renewal. They bought it for back taxes. Over the following year, the house was systematically transformed, not demolished and rebuilt. Instead, renovated carefully with salvaged materials and low-cost interventions that any homeowner with modest skills and genuine motivation could replicate. That was the entire point. The integral urban house was not an architectural statement. It was a manual for living. What they built inside that Victorian shell was unlike anything that had existed before in an American city. The roof held a containerized vegetable garden, proof, they said, that even apartment dwellers with no yard at all could grow food. At ground level, raised beds amended with an inch of fresh compost produced crops continuously. Solar collectors on the south face fed a hot water storage tank. The backup electric heater, over years of operation, was switched on exactly 3 times, and even then it was warming water that had already been preheated by the sun to 95 degrees. The back of the property held what can only be described as a miniature ecosystem. 15 chickens, some on the roof and some at ground level. 10 to 20 rabbits, depending on the season. A fish pond stocked with native California species, including blackfish, rainbow trout, and crayfish large enough to rival lobster. Below the chicken cages sat trays of worms, which fed on the chicken's manure and in turn fed the fish. The bees kept in hives on the property pollinated the garden and occasionally fell into the fish pond where they became yet another protein source. Nothing was wasted. Everything cycled. The composting toilet was called a clivus multrum, a Swedish invention that had been approved for use across Scandinavia, but was banned for residential use in almost every American state. Berkeley's health officials allowed the Farallones Institute to install one on an experimental basis. Waste fell into a fiberglass tank, sloped and baffled, where aerobic decomposition converted it over 2 years into pathogen-free compost. The toilet consumed no water, none. In a country where conventional toilets were already using 30 to 40% of total household water consumption, this was not a minor efficiency gain. It was a different way of thinking about what waste means. Greywater from sinks and showers was captured and redirected. Almost nothing left the property as pollution. The house was a 7-bedroom building. It housed several residents at a time, welcomed dozens of visitors every Saturday afternoon, held seminars, and hosted students from Berkeley and researchers from across the country. By the end of 1979, its combined electricity, gas, and water bills averaged $30 a month. Architectural Digest would later include it among the most significant houses of the 20th century. But here's the thing that gets lost when people talk about the integral urban house as a curiosity of the counterculture era. It was not marginal. It was not fringe. It was directly connected to the center of California state government. In 1975, Governor Jerry Brown appointed Sim van der Ren as California state architect. Van der Ren brought the same whole systems philosophy he had applied to the Victorian house at 1516 Fifth Street to the design of state government buildings. The Gregory Bateson Building in Sacramento, completed in 1981, was the first large-scale structure in the United States, designed explicitly to save energy. It used 80% less energy than comparable buildings of the time. Through passive solar design, natural ventilation, microprocessor-controlled shading, and night flush cooling systems, it won multiple architectural awards. It is still in use today. Van der Ren also created, within state government, the Office of Appropriate Technology, a bureaucracy dedicated to promoting exactly the kind of systems the integral urban house had demonstrated: solar power, greywater recycling, composting, and renewable energy. The office educated Californians, simplified regulations for owner-built homes, and began to inject ecological design into state procurement and building standards. For a few years in the late 1970s, it genuinely looked like the integral urban house was not an experiment but a prototype. It seemed that California, and possibly the country, was going to follow where it led. Then January 3rd, 1983 arrived. Governor Brown left office. His successor, George Deukmejian, was a Republican state legislator closely aligned with the state's major business interests, who had run on a platform of rolling back what he characterized as Brown's excess. One of Deukmejian's first official acts after taking office was the closure of the Office of Appropriate Technology. No transition, no transfer of functions. The office was shut down, and its publications were left to gather dust. That same year, federal funding for renewable energy research was gutted in Washington. Ronald Reagan, who had already removed the solar panels from the White House roof in 1981, panels Carter had installed as a symbol of the direction the country needed to move, was 2 years into a systematic reversal of the entire 1970s energy policy framework. Tax credits for solar installation were eliminated. Research programs were defunded. The political message from both Sacramento and Washington was unmistakable. The energy crisis was over. Oil was back, and the people who had spent a decade designing alternatives to dependence should go back to the margins where they belonged. The integral urban house closed in 1984. The official explanation was operational. Costs were rising. The volunteer labor that had kept the experiment running, architecture students, researchers, activists, was increasingly hard to sustain. The cultural moment that had made urban homesteading feel urgent had passed in the California of 1984, with oil prices stable and Deukmejian in the governor's mansion. Nobody in government was answering the Farallones Institute's calls. But walk through the logic of what was lost. Every system the integral urban house demonstrated in 1974 has since been independently validated. Solar hot water heating pays for itself in under 10 years and has been commercially available for decades. Composting toilets are now legal in most states in the United States and are common in Europe and Australia. Greywater recycling is standard in green building. Urban chickens were banned in hundreds of American cities for decades after the house closed. Berkeley itself restricted them, and they have only been re-legalized in city after city over the last 15 years, as if the idea needed to be invented again from scratch. Aquaponics, the combination of fish farming and vegetable production in closed water loops, is now a fast-growing commercial industry. Every single thing the house was doing in 1974 is now either a product you can buy, a practice that homesteaders pursue, or a system that mainstream architects incorporate into premium, sustainable design. The house proved all of it 50 years ago, on a condemned Victorian lot, on a budget held together with salvaged timber and volunteer labor. And then it was forgotten so thoroughly that most people who now buy composting toilets, install solar thermal panels, raise backyard chickens, or grow food in raised beds, have no idea that a group of scientists in Berkeley had already documented exactly what happens when you do all of it at once, in a city, in a house, for 10 years. The building at 1516 5th Street in Berkeley still stands. If you drive past it today, you will see nothing remarkable. There is no plaque. There is no marker. It is an ordinary rental property in a neighborhood that has long since been absorbed into the broader Berkeley housing stock. The people who live there almost certainly do not know what happened inside those walls. Sim van der Ren died in October 2024 at the age of 89. His obituaries in the San Francisco Chronicle and the Architecture Press noted his career, his buildings, his decades of teaching at Berkeley. Most of them did not mention the integral urban house at all. Bill and Helga Olkowski spent the rest of their careers writing and teaching about urban food production and integrated pest management. The book The Farallones Institute, published through the Sierra Club in 1979, A 600-page manual covering every system in the house in precise, replicable detail is now a collector's item. It is not in print. Here is what the story of the integral urban house actually tells us, 50 years later. It tells us that the things we now sell as innovations were already proven before most people alive today were born. It tells us that the window for large-scale adoption of these ideas was opened by a geopolitical crisis in 1973, that a generation of extraordinary scientists and architects spent a decade building the evidence and the blueprints, and that the window was then closed by a political transition in 1983 that had nothing to do with whether the ideas worked. They worked. That is not in question. $30 a month, 7 bedrooms, a city lot. The question that the integral urban house leaves hanging in the air is not whether this kind of living is possible. It demonstrated that 50 years ago, with technology from the 1970s, on a condemned Victorian property bought for back taxes. The question is why we keep being surprised by ideas that have already been proven, already documented, and already forgotten once before.